Hi everyone. In this video, let's talk about the principles of design. So in a composition of any kind, whether it be fine art, photography, interior design, or architecture, a composition is a placement or arrangement of visual elements to create a sense of unity. And the goal of a composition is to have each of those separate items come together as one unified form. So one way to talk about how to create this unified form is to use the principles of design. They are balance, rhythm, scale, proportion, emphasis, and harmony. So far in this course, we've talked a lot about some of the elements of design, such as line, shape, and pattern. All right, we've talked about light and texture and form. Color will be another semester, not this year. All right. These elements are your designer's tools. They sit in your toolbox and they're more quantifiable. The principles of design, therefore, are how you take those elements and combine them. All right, they're more of an abstract concept or a theory and can really determine the success or failure of your design. We're going to talk about each one of these. So let's talk about balance first. It is the idea of presenting a view that offers equal interest to the eye. It can be a symmetrical or an asymmetrical balance, or even a radial balance. So here's an example of a symmetrical balance. You've got equal physical weight, all right? But remember in our design compositions, we're talking about visual weight or interest. All right, and on the bottom there, you've got an example of asymmetrical balance. Maybe one heavier or more interesting thing on one side and several smaller or of less emphasized items on the other. So here's a couple of examples of balance. We see radial balance, symmetrical balance, and asymmetrical balance. Moving on to rhythm. Rhythm's very important. It's the glue that holds all of your dissimilar elements together in a composition. Right? And rhythm allows the viewer's eye to move smoothly along or across an object or a space and helps create a unified or total design. Couple different kinds of rhythm can be used. One is repetition. The other is alternation, one and then the other. And final is progression or gradation, which has intermediate steps. So here's an example of repetition. These painted ladies, all right, each the same, but create a total composition. On the left, you have an example of alternation. These waves are creating a rhythm across the facade of this building. And finally, on the right, we have an example of gradation that pulls the eye along these diagonal paths. Next, I want to talk about scale and proportion. And let's talk about these two things together because many students get them confused. They're similar concepts, so let's make sure that you know the difference. Scale is deals with the size relationship of an object within or a relationship to an entire space. All right, so one whole object to the entire space. In general, the human scale should be used as a guide for your design. And our designer's goal is to have our items, whatever they may be, scaled appropriately for each room or for each space or for each building site. All right, and to have those items fit the users. Proportion, however, similar idea, but it deals with space divisions and the relationships between them, generally within a specific object or a specific area. For example, if you have a elevation of a building or a wall, All right, the relationship of the individual parts of that elevation, perhaps the windows compared to the doors, would be a proportional relationship. Proportions are very important to give a sense of stability and belonging to your design. So let's talk about a couple of examples, starting with scale. Here on the left, we have the US Supreme Court building, and it's an example of good use of scale because they are the use of this building and um, the intended goal here is to create monumental scale. All right, and they've done that. Versus on the right-hand side here, we have a poor example of scale of these teeny tiny villas, all right, very close together. An object can be scaled appropriately for its surroundings, but then have poor proportions. Again, remember the proportions are the individual relationships within that particular object. So here's some examples of bad versus good proportion. And these are very abstract, of course, but the suggestion is that absolute equality in the division kind of is a monotonous look. All right. And also, if it's too uneven, you lack harmony. And so here are some examples of good proportion also. Let's look at some examples in architecture. Here on the left, we have the Easton Neston Estate in England, an example of good proportion. And now remember, we're looking at the facade here, or this elevation, and looking at the individual elements of that elevation and how they relate to each other. On the right-hand side here, we have an example of a residence in Virginia, poor proportion, and we can see that the cone-shaped portico here at the front of this building is massively overscaled with proportion to the rest of the building. All right, so there's an error in proportion. Moving on to our next principle of design, let's talk about emphasis, which is also sometimes called focus or focal point. Emphasis overall involves, the overall center of interest, and your viewer's eye is going to be drawn to a focal point. There can be different levels of attention or emphasis, a dominant, a subdominant, even a subordinate level. And here's a couple of examples of emphasis in architecture. Let's finish up by talking about harmony. Harmony or unity is the ultimate goal of your design. You are trying to create a cohesive space or a harmonious object that both functions well, obviously, and is aesthetically pleasing. And this is achieved by incorporating those elements of design and following the principles of design. Thanks, everyone. That was your quick overview of the principles of design and how they can be applied to architecture.